So I'm going to tell you a story today. It's like a fairy story because it's full of magic. And it happened long ago. There was a young girl who was on a journey of discovery that took her all around the world. And many years ago, on the island of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, she met a teacher, a guide, someone who was so established in their relationship with the divine that it was like sitting in the presence of one of the ancient mystics. On one of the days where she had been studying with him all day long, an idea came to her mind that she very much wanted to explore one of the valleys that seemed beautiful and extraordinary, very tropical and full of mystery. She overheard two friends that she was really just getting to know talking about a journey they were about to make into this valley, Waipio Valley, a horseshoe-shaped valley with valley walls that were 1,000 foot high, with waterfalls pouring down and a river that ran through the center of the lush green valley. She immediately asked if she could join them on this adventure, and they said yes. They drove into the valley down one of the steepest roads imaginable, winding, no edges, dangerous at every turn, but they got to the bottom of the valley safely. However, there were certain things that she did not know that she learned that day. For example, she had no idea about rivers. She didn't understand that when it's been raining for days, you do not walk into a river. When it's been raining for days and the rivers are flooded, you may not be able to drive through a river. And sometimes you need a little magic to save the day. So when they got to the bottom of the valley, the rivers were very full. And not knowing anything about rivers, it didn't worry her at all when the driver, Greg, said, "Let's just drive through. I think we can make it." And it didn't occur to her that it was a little bit unusual that even though the water was lapping the hood of the car, the truck just kept going. They drove through several streams until they reached the back of the valley where there was a huge, wide river flowing fast. The young guy, the one who'd actually invited the adventure because he had things to collect from the back of the valley where he had lived for several months, Jax, set off into the stream because Greg refused to drive into it. It was too wide, too fast. Greg tried to convince Jax that it actually wasn't safe to step into the river and that not only should they not try to drive through, but they should under no circumstances try to walk in there either. But Jax was defiant. He was young, impetuous, he'd lived in the valley for months, and as he told this young girl, "I've crossed this river so many times, and there is nothing to be worried about. It's not that deep." And so, not knowing either of her friends terribly well yet, they had really only recently met, she looked at Greg, who was being very wise and circumspect and didn't want to drive his vehicle into the river, and she thought, well, okay, that's understandable, but here's Jax, who's lived down here for months, and he tells me he's crossed this river many times and that it's not so deep. And off he's going, he's walking into the river while I deliberate about what to do. And so as she had these thoughts, she just decided, this young guy, he's lived here, he knows the river well. I bet Greg doesn't know this river all that well. He doesn't come down here. So of course he's a little bit concerned, but I'm going to trust Jax because he knows the river. And so she followed him into the water. By this time, she was up to her knees in the river, and looked back over her shoulder at Greg, who was pacing frustratedly on the bank. And finally, he just came to the decision, oh my goodness, if you're going in, I'm going to have to go in because somebody is going to have to save you. She didn't really know what he meant. It didn't seem all that deep. And although the river was very, very wide, Jax was ahead of her and he was doing just fine. But what she didn't realize was that rivers can flash flood in an instant. And it had been raining for days and days. And the valley walls were over 1,000 feet tall. Rain had been falling on the mountains all around the valley and was pouring down in waterfalls even as they were wading across. And as they reached the center of the river, far from the bank, far from the safety of the truck, far from their destination, all of a sudden, the very worst thing possible began to happen. The water level began to rise very suddenly. And as the water got deeper, it became stronger. Quick, said Greg, let's link arms. Hand on hand, shoulder to shoulder. One of us will move 1 foot at a time, and the other two will anchor and lock in, and we will help each other to ground and anchor so that we can get across. Don't all take your feet off the ground at the same time. Synchronize your steps. All three of them realized that the water was getting quite a lot faster, quite a lot stronger, and that Greg's idea was probably the only way they were going to get across safely. They linked arms, hands on shoulders, shoulder to shoulder. One took a foot up, moved it across. The other two anchored into the rock, anchored into the river. The next one took a step. And that worked for maybe a few steps. But all of a sudden, the water level rose even higher. Now it was almost waist high. And they could barely, all three of them at the same time, anchor and ground. And it was getting stronger. By the time the river water inched its way up above the waist of the young woman, she was beginning to panic and could hardly hold her breath because they were starting to all get pushed together, all together, and nobody could anchor, not even Greg, who was strong and heavy, but even he couldn't hold his footing. All of a sudden, something extraordinary happened. Jax turned round and looked at the young girl, and as she gazed at him, she realized it was not his eyes looking at her, but her teacher's eyes. And when he spoke to her, it was not Jax's voice that was speaking. It was her teacher's voice speaking, Human's voice. Get out of the river now. She felt it. She felt his power. She felt Human's power shooting through Jax's eyes, shooting laser-like through his voice. And can you guess what happened? In a split second, I felt the power of my teacher coming into my body, my terrified body, and without any thought whatsoever, I somehow immediately knew what to do, and I threw my gaze across the wide river that was still between us and the bank. And I wrapped my energy around a tree that was on the bankside. And in a split second, I found myself standing on the opposite bank. No time had passed. I had no idea how I got out of the river. I hadn't taken a single step. Somehow something extraordinary had happened, and I was safe. I was shaking like a leaf. I was shaking like a leaf, not even aware of how I got out of the river. But as I looked into the river, I could see that it was real because Greg and Jax were still in the middle of the river being pushed down. Greg was a little heavier, a little taller, a little stronger, and he managed to anchor in and somehow get pushed just a little ways before he was able to grab enough rock and anchor enough to get himself out of the deep water. Jax was younger, lighter. He got washed down quite a ways, but fortunately he was not hurt. And somehow, before he got too far downriver, he was able to scramble to shore. And that is part one of an adventure that taught me that there are miracles beyond our wildest imagining, and you just never know when something extraordinary is going to happen in your life, where everything you thought was real gets turned around 180 degrees, and suddenly something you never imagined yourself ever experiencing has actually happened. Something extraordinary, some miracle of grace has played itself out, and actually, in my case, saved my life. Life is stranger than we think. It is stranger than we can think. And it is an amazing blessing to begin to live in the mystery, in relationship with the mystery. And we can do that. And actually, we're meant to, because we're part of it. And the beautiful thing about fairy stories is that they remind us of what is actually real. And this story happened, and it happened in my life. And I will look forward to telling you part two.